Hello everybody, my name is Zeke, welcome to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about some fantasy and sci-fi series that I really want to read, hopefully sometime in the near future, but obviously series are long and I want to read other books too, so it's not like I'm going to suddenly drop everything else and focus only on these, but they are books that have been on my mind a lot recently and books that I hope to get to before I am 40 years old. So, we'll see how many of these actually come into fruition. So this idea kind of came about because I have kind of made it a personal goal, to get more into fantasy and sci-fi again. When I was younger, that was basically all I read. And over the past few years, I've really shifted away from my roots as a fantasy and sci-fi solo reader, I guess. And I've read, I think, most of the big series that I really wanted to, and I think that contributed a lot to it. I'd say a lot of the same fantasy and sci-fi series tend to get talked about a lot, and so I would always pick those up and I'd go through them and really enjoy them. But I think there's so much more out there that I just never got to, and so much that I have kind of shifted away from in the past few years that I want to get back to. Now, some of these are actually series that have been on my mind for a while, like throughout the past few years, and some of them are just more I've been thinking about them recently and I really want to get into them, and I think a lot of these could be good gateways for me to get back into reading more fantasy and sci-fi. I'd say also the problem has been, over the past few years, the fantasy and sci-fi I've been reading has been very hit or miss, whereas before I think I basically loved everything I read, and that could have been a product of age, but it also could have been a product of me just reading really good stuff. And I think I haven't been necessarily doing that as much. And so I've read some really incredible fantasy and sci-fi stuff over the past few years. I'd say Octavia Butler really stands out to me, but then I've read some other stuff that I won't mention that has kind of deterred me from reading fantasy and sci-fi, and I think that is an issue that I really need to correct. So the first one I'm going to talk about is something I'm actually very shocked I haven't read. That's the Expanse series by James S.A. Corey. I do not have the author written down, but that sounds right to me. I know it's a pseudonym, I think, for two people who write the series. It might be, the series is, I think, done at this point, which is even more motivation to pick it up. I think I haven't picked it up because it's very long, but this is kind of an epic sci-fi series I don't know a ton about, but I know, because it is so long and I don't know everything that happens, which is good because I wouldn't want that all to be spoiled for me. But I think the first book, we're kind of people are in space at this point. They kind of colonized or conquered the solar system, whatever you want to call it, and but they haven't made it to the wider universe, and everything starts in the first book with some kind of mystery. I know there's a lot of different organizations and parties involved in this world. There's a lot going on, but I've also heard that there are some more personal stories throughout the series that are interspersed with kind of the grander conflict, and that's been very encouraging for me because I really love well-written characters in my fantasy and sci-fi, so hopefully that kind of put me at ease that I'd probably be getting that in this series. And so I really want to read it at some point. I don't know if it'll work for me, just because I haven't read as much sci-fi as I wish I had. I've been much more fantasy focused, and I just think this is such a quintessential modern sci-fi book series at this point that I'm just shocked I haven't read it, and I really need to get to it. So that's first on my list. Don't know when it'll happen though, because it is very long. Next is kind of not the opposite, but very different in my mind to The Expanse, and I don't know how true that is, but I want to read selected works from the Culture series by Ian M. Banks. This is older, I think 80s, 90s, maybe early 2000s sci-fi, so should have a different feel because of that, and also because this society is more utopian, so I've heard. It's very much more homogenous, and it's about kind of this really superior culture called the Culture. Whether they're actually superior, they believe they're superior, and kind of interactions with other parties that they come across, is my understanding of it. I could be off base there, but also the series is kind of self-contained stories, is what I've heard. So that's obviously very different from a very long series like The Expanse that you have to commit to reading like a normal series in chronological order. And so I've heard mixed things about Culture, actually. I've heard that some books are just not very good. To be honest, I don't know how true that is either. But I've heard that there are some books, like the second book particularly, I just remember hearing is incredible. And so I really want to get to that. I think that it sounds like a very interesting premise to me. And also, because they're self-contained stories, it's not as much of a commitment, and I don't have to commit to reading every single book. I don't have to start with the first book, which people say is not the best starting place, and people don't tend to like that much. So I just think that's a really good option for me, especially if I want to be reading this interspersed with other books, because if it's not one chronological continuous story, if the stories are self-contained, it's much easier to kind of take a break for a few months and then go back and not feel like you've forgotten everything. And so I think that is going to be something I really try to find. This has been on my radar for so long, but I always look for it in bookstores and on like online libraries, and I can never find it for whatever reason. So I think I just need to commit, maybe buy it on Kindle or something like that, and actually commit to reading it, because I think it could be really up my alley. And so I think it's important for me to try to do that. Next is another one. We're transitioning to kind of fantasy now that has been on my radar for quite a while, and that's anything by Juliette Marillier, but I've heard the Seven Waters series is particularly good. I've heard that what makes it so good is her writing is incredible, and it's kind of more classic fantasy. I don't know a ton about the actual story. I don't really know anything about the actual story, if we're being honest, but I think it's very like nature-based fantasy, very traditional fantasy, and I feel like I really need that at this point. I really want to read something like that. I've heard, I don't know if it's like whimsical, I don't know if that's the right word, but very beautiful, like world building and writing, as I said. And I think she's supposed to be a very good character writer as well. So I think that all those things had made it seem very appealing to me. Just her as an author in general. I don't know why at this point I haven't picked her up yet. And I think it's a shame that I haven't, and I really want to. So I think I'm gonna give Seven Waters, the first book in that series, a shot, because I've heard very good things about that, and I think that's the thing I've heard most talked about out of all of her work. And I think I read a synopsis at one point, even if I don't remember it now, and it sounded interesting at the time. So hopefully that'll go over well, and I'll enjoy that, and I'll be able to continue on with her work. Because she seems like a very exciting author and someone I want to read from. Next is another one that I'm shocked I haven't read at this point, and I really should have picked up years ago, and that's the Bloodsworn Saga by John Gwynne. I remember when like the first book was coming out. I think the whole series is done by now. I could be wrong on that though. And it sounded really interesting to me then. John Gwynne is a very popular modern fantasy author. He has another series, I don't remember what it's called. But I think the first book is called Malice, and I think that's like a 4-book series I've also heard a lot about, and I knew about even before like the Bloodsworn Saga was released and coming out. And so he's been on my radar for a very long time, and for whatever reason I've never picked it up. I think I always heard at the beginning he was more like military fantasy and like darker stuff, is if I'm remembering correctly, and so I think that kind of dissuaded me a little, especially when there were so many other fantasy series I really hadn't tackled and really wanted to read, so it wasn't kind of near the top of my list. But at this point, with his new series, I just heard such incredible things about it. I think it's Norse mythology inspired. I've heard that it's very, very dark, which I think I would love to read at this point. I do like a little bit of a darker fantasy book. That usually works pretty well for me, and I just think that I really owe it to give this author a chance, because I've heard about him for so long, and people really love especially his new series, and especially for getting back into fantasy, I think this would be a perfect place. I think it's only 3 books, so they're very, very long, as much of epic fantasy is, but that like 3-book commitment doesn't feel overwhelming, and so that's definitely something I want to give a shot relatively soon, hopefully. Next thing I'm going to talk about, I guess, is kind of cheating a tiny bit, but not really. I have already read the first book, but That's Dune and the subsequent follow-ups to Dune. I read the original Dune book. You can see the bottom of it up there a few years ago at this point, and I enjoyed it a lot. I understand why people love it so much. I understand why it's a classic at this point, and I just, for whatever reason, never continued on. I think I was just very satisfied with Dune as like a standalone, and I was like, oh, maybe one day I'll pick them up, but I just never got around to the sequels. And I'm very well aware that you only read the sequels that are written by the original author, not the ones by his son. I've heard very terrible things about those, so if I do continue on, I will not be reading those. I'll only be reading the original sequels. But either way, I recently finally watched the first Dune movie that came out in like 2021, and I really enjoyed it. Kind of put it back on my radar. I have not been thinking about Dune a lot, just for whatever reason, just has not really stuck with me that much. But then watching the movie, I was like, okay, yeah, this was really good, and I really should give the rest of it a chance. And I don't know if that means I'm gonna reread the first book. We'll see if I feel the need to do that, but I definitely want to continue on just because I think it is obviously such a quintessential foundational science fiction book, and I've heard that they get pretty weird, the books, as they get on, and that is very intriguing to me, and I kind of want to see what that means, what that's all about. And so I definitely want to continue at some point with Dune, and we'll see. I don't know if I'm going to read all the sequels. I don't really know anything about the sequels whatsoever, and I definitely would need a refresher on the first book, so we'll see how that goes if I end up doing that. The last thing I want to mention is also this one is cheating because technically I have read it, kind of, and that's The Kingkiller Chronicles by Patrick Rothfuss. The third book is never coming out, obviously, or we'll see, but like it's been over 10 years at this point. First of all, that has kind of dissuaded me from the series from the beginning, but I did actually read or try to read it a bunch of years ago at this point, and I read the first book, The Name of the Wind, and I really enjoyed it. It wasn't like my favorite thing ever, but there was a lot I loved about it, and I really liked the like school setting, and I thought that it made me very interested in the rest of the series. That was the main takeaway from that book, because it feels like a lot of setup. But then I read the second book, and I like could not get through it. There's like a lot of people don't like the second book, and there's like a certain point that I've heard that like people get to that makes them put it down and not like it. I don't think I even got that far. I was just very bored. I didn't think it really was continuing on in a way that I really cared about at the time, and so I put it down. I had other things I wanted to read, and I just read them instead, but I don't know if I gave it a fair chance. And also, I do want to reread the first book because it's been so long. I'd be interested in seeing if my opinions have changed, how they've changed, and maybe if the third book is ever announced, that will give me a actual motivation to continue on with the series, and not continue on, restart. I would have to restart and reread it, but that is something that I've been thinking about recently, and I might end up doing, but I would have to have motivation of that third book, I think, to actually make me do that, because I don't know, the second book could still be a challenge for me, even going in like expecting to maybe have a challenge. Okay, so those are some of, I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but those are, I'd say, like the main fantasy and sci-fi series that have been on my mind recently that I really want to pick up at some point. I won't say near future, in the future. And I'm excited for a lot of these. I'm excited for all of these, or they wouldn't be on this list, obviously. I'd also be interested to know if hearing about any of these has made you think of any other similar series or series that you think I might like. I'd be very interested to hear those recommendations. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe if you want, and I will see you in the next one.